read the intro by Conrad Kellen, we can read the preface written by Jacques Ellul himself. Propaganda, by whatever name we may call it, has become a very general phenomenon in the modern world. Differences in political regimes matter little. Differences in social levels are more important. And most important is national self-awareness. We're number one, USA, number one. In the world today, there are three great propaganda blocks: the USSR, or today Russia, China, and the United States. This book was written in 1965. That's why he mentions USSR. These are the most important propaganda systems in terms of scope, depth, and coherence. Incidentally, they represent three entirely different types and methods of propaganda. Interesting. Next are the propaganda systems in various stages of development and effectiveness, but less advanced than in the three of a whole group of countries. These are the socialist republics of Europe and Asia: Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Yugoslavia, East Germany, North Vietnam. They model their propaganda on that of the USSR, with some gaps, some lack of understanding, and without the adequate resources. Then there are West Germany, France, Spain, Egypt, South Vietnam, and Korea. Then there are West Germany, France, Spain, Egypt, South Vietnam, and Korea, with less elaborate and rather diffuse forms of propaganda. Countries such as Italy and Argentina, which once had powerful propaganda systems, no longer use this weapon. Wow. Well, back then, whatever the diversity of countries and methods, they have one characteristic in common: concern with effectiveness. Propaganda is made, first of all, because of a will to action, for the purpose of effectively arming policy and giving irresistible power to its decisions. Whoever handles this instrument can be concerned solely with effectiveness. This is the supreme law, which must never be forgotten when the phenomena of propaganda is analyzed. Ineffective propaganda is no propaganda. This instrument belongs to the technological universe, shares its characteristics, and is indissolubly linked to it. Not only is propaganda itself a technique, it is also an indispensable condition for the development of technological progress and the establishment of a technological civilization. And as with all techniques, propaganda is subject to the law of efficiency. So he's saying that in the modern society cannot exist without the propaganda that goes along with it. Technical progress and the technological civilization have propaganda as an indispensable condition. So propaganda is subject to the law of efficiency, but whereas it is relatively easy to study a precise technique whose scope can be defined, a study of propaganda runs into some extraordinary obstacles. From the outset, it is obvious that there is great uncertainty about the phenomena itself, arising first of all from a priori moral or political concepts. So because of our programming, moral or political, we don't know propaganda for certain, about propaganda with certainty. Propaganda is usually regarded as a evil. This in itself makes a study difficult. So to call something evil makes it difficult to study, as I learned from a YouTube comment calling Jacques Italy evil and trying to hamper my progress in my studies of his book. To study anything properly, one must put aside ethical judgments. So to study anything properly, one must put aside ethical judgments. Perhaps an objective study will lead us back to them, but only later, and with full cognizance of the facts. So once we learn more, we can try to analyze morality better, is what he's saying. But that comes later. First, you have to set aside the ethical judgments. A second source of confusion is the general conviction, derived from past experience, that propaganda consists mainly of tall stories, disseminated by means of lies. Well, today, the coronavirus hype, it's almost like it's a tall story. All the changes we're being forced to go along with as a result of a tall story. I mean, people die of flu every year, so why make a big deal this year? That's what I always say whenever they have the avian flu or the swine flu or this flu or that flu. They're flying a whole bunch of lies into what we have to comply with. Anyway, so propaganda is not usually tall stories, is what he's trying to say. To adopt this view is to prevent oneself from understanding anything about the actual phenomenon, which is very different from what it was in the past. This was in 1965 he said that. Let's see what Goebbels said. Goebbels said, "We do not talk to say something, but to obtain a certain effect." So we don't talk just to say something, we talk to obtain a certain effect. This goes for all news channels and most TV channels, actually. Any entertainment. It's true. And F.C. Bartlett accurately states that the goal of propaganda is not to increase political understanding of events, but to obtain results through action. So the goal of propaganda is not to increase the political understanding of the events, but to obtain results through action. How true is that today? We're not learning about biochemistry or viruses, no. We're just learning about wear your masks and, oh no, people are dying everywhere. Let's cry and be afraid. Harold D. Lasswell's definition of the goal of propaganda is accurate: to maximize the power at home by subordinating groups and individuals while reducing the material cost of power. Wow, so propaganda is very powerful because it reduces the material cost of power and maximizes the power at home by subordinating groups and individuals too. Similarly, in war, propaganda is an attempt to win victory with a minimum of physical expense. Before the war, propaganda is a substitute for physical violence. During the war, it is a supplement to it. So all the degrading treatment we get at stores and telling us to wear the masks all the time, which is itself a sort of a torture experience, and that is intensified by the propaganda, because that makes the sheeple more likely to shout us down when we don't wear the mask. So yeah, it's very true that propaganda is a supplement to war during wartime. Okay, so when these obstacles have been removed, obstacles of confusion of the fact that propaganda is tall tales or that is a confusing area because it's considered evil, when these two things are removed, it is still very difficult to determine what constitutes propaganda in our world and what the nature of propaganda is. This is because it is a secret action. The temptation is then twofold: to agree with Jacques' drawing court that everything is propaganda, because everything in the political or economic spheres seems to be penetrated and molded by this force, or as a certain modern American social scientists have done, to abandon the term propaganda altogether because it cannot be defined with any degree of precision. Either course is inadmissible intellectual surrender. To adopt either attitude would lead us to abandon the study of a phenomenon that exists and needs to be defined. So he thinks it's important enough, propaganda, that we have to define it and not just surrender by considering it everything propaganda, or that it cannot be studied because it's everywhere or it's not definable precisely. So then we then came up against the extreme difficulty of definition. We can immediately discard such simplistic definitions as Marbury or Ogle's. Propaganda is any effort to change opinions or attitudes. The propagandist is anyone who communicates his ideas with the intent of influencing his listener. Such a definition would include the teacher, the priest, indeed any person conversing with another on any topic. Such a broad definition clearly does not help us to understand the specific character of propaganda. As far as definitions are concerned, there has been a characteristic evolution in the United States. From 1920 to about 1933, the main emphasis was on the psychological. Propaganda is a manipulation of psychological symbols having goals of which the listener is not conscious. Since the appearance of Laswell's studies, propaganda by other means and with stated objectives has been considered possible. Attention then became focused on the intention of the propagandist. In more recent books, the aim to indoctrinate, particularly in regard to political, economic, and social matters, has been regarded as the hallmark of propaganda. Within this frame of reference, one could determine what constitutes propaganda by looking at the propagandist. Such and such a person is a propagandist, therefore his works and deeds are propaganda. But it appears that American authors eventually accepted the definition given by the Institute for Propaganda Analysis and inspired by Laswell. Propaganda is the expression of opinions or actions carried out deliberately by individuals or groups with a view to influencing the opinions or actions of other individuals or groups for predetermined ends and through psychological manipulation. We could quote definitions for pages on end. An Italian author, Antonio Miotto, says that propaganda is a technique of social pressure which tends to create psychological or social groups with a unified structure across the homogeneity of the affective and mental states of individuals under consideration. So it's a technique of social pressure which tends to create psychological or social groups with a unified structure across the homogeneity of the affective and mental states of the individuals under consideration. So it creates conformity through social pressure and creation of groups. For Leonard W. Dew, the well-known American specialist, it is an attempt to modify personalities and control the behavior of individuals in relation to goals considered non-scientific or of doubtful value in a specific society and time period. So modifying personalities, controlling behaviors of individuals in relation to these non-scientific and doubtful value goals in our specific society and time period. It's interesting to note that it was after 9/11 that Bush passed a law which made it possible for doctors to be able to hold people in mental hospitals indefinitely, or at least for longer than they could, and actually lock them down and observe them and feed drugs and certain diets to them. So this was all done after 9/11, when the Nazi or the fascist Bush society was coming into view, and he needed to silence any dissidents with this kind of a punishment. So yeah, this is what mental hospitals are, psychiatry is. It's to control the behavior science, they call it, and it's to contain all the bad behaviors that would be bad for the society and the non-scientific and doubtful goals. And we would find even more remote definitions if we examine the German or Russian literature on the subject. I will not give a definition of my own here. I only wanted to show the uncertainty among specialists on the question. I consider it more useful to proceed with the analysis of the characteristics of propaganda as an existing sociological phenomenon. It is perhaps proper to underline this term, sociological phenomenon. We shall examine propaganda in both its past and present forms, for obviously we cannot eliminate from our study the highly developed propaganda systems of Hitler's Germany, Stalin's Russia, and fascist Italy. This seems obvious, but is not. Many writers do not agree with this approach. They establish a certain image or definition of propaganda and proceed to the study of whatever corresponds to their definition. Or yielding the attraction of a scientific study, they try to experiment with some particular method of propaganda on a small groups and in small doses, at which moment it ceases to be propaganda. At which moment it ceases to be propaganda. So he sees it as a sociological phenomenon, not just in small doses and small groups, and also not with a certain image or definition. Pre-programming it. Study. So to study propaganda, we must not turn to the psychologist, something John Taylor Gatto also mentioned, but to the propagandist. We must examine not a test group, but a whole nation subjected to real and effective propaganda. Of course, this excludes all so-called scientific types of study, but at least we shall have respected the object of our study, unlike many present-day specialists who establish a rigorous method of observation, but in order to apply it, lose the object to be studied. Rather, we shall consider what the nature of propaganda is, wherever it is applied, and wherever it is dominated by a concern for effectiveness. And these are the areas that he mentions. Propaganda, he analyzes. And this I'll return to the next video of the preface of propaganda by Jacques Ellul.